So, first, a warm welcome to everyone in this room. Our special guests of the board of the IFACCA, the panel, the audience consisting of colleagues from the culture, the ministry, culture agencies, organizations. My name is Staffan Forsell, and I'm the Director General of the Swedish Arts Council. And now for 3 days I have the great honor and pleasure to share time with the board members of IFACCA. This week I'm hosting a board meeting with persons from countries all around the world. Canada, Malaysia, Namibia, Ireland, Lithuania, Argentina, Chile, England and the Solomon Islands. And you will soon learn to know them better. It's the first time we have this meeting in Sweden, and last time we were in this spring we were in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia for the World Summit. IFACCA, or in other words, the International Federation of Art Council and Cultural Agencies, is a global network of Arts Council and Ministries of Culture, with member institutions in over 70 countries. The vision for IFACCA is a world in which art and culture thrive and are recognized by governments and people for their contribution to society. And during my 6 years as Director General of the Swedish Arts Council, being part of the IFACCA board has been the most rewarding external assignment I have had. We have been able to have very open discussions about a range of subjects connecting to culture policy. In this discussion, we learn from each other. We also get an outside perspective on current discussions in our own countries, giving clarity through a healthy distance. Culture political debate in Sweden in recent years has sometimes questioned government assignments for everyone's equal rights to participate in cultural life, creating opportunities for a diversity of voices. The argument being that there is a risk for political control of the artistic content and thus a limitation of artistic freedom. Freedom of expression is a fundamental right. Without it, we do not have democracy. But recently, we can see this freedom being attacked across the globe. The lack to access to freedom of expression especially affects those who are marginalized, such as minorities in all parts of the world. Discrimination is one cause of unequal access to the freedom of expression. This is why it's vital that promoting freedom of expression within culture and the art is combined with the working for equal rights to access. I hope that exchanging experiences can help us all to work even harder through those human rights in our home countries. I am very happy to have you all here, and I'm looking forward to follow the interesting discussion moderated by Magdalena Moreno, Executive Director at the International Federation of Art Councils and Cultural Agencies. And in this panel, we also have Simon Burrow, Director and CEO of the Canada Council of the Arts, and Patrick Sam, Chairperson of the National Arts Councils of Namibia. And when we will end this session, we will invite all the present members of the board on stage for more informal discussions. Magdalena, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Staffan. Thank you, the Swedish Arts Council, Kulturens. It is a real honor to be here. For many of us, it is our first time in Sweden, and the weather has been generous, has been kind, and we appreciate the beautiful sun. We are really thrilled to be here. We know that there are a lot of issues that are of critical importance to the globe, not only to Sweden, but we've already had rich discussions, not only at the board meeting, but also speaking to some of you informally or in other meetings, and recognizing that we all believe fundamentally that arts and culture are important for our societies to thrive, and we need a dynamic ecosystem, and recognizing the diversity of actors that make up that ecosystem that is so critically important. We're here to discuss the freedom of artistic expression, and we're also here to listen to other perspectives that as we work in IFACCA with over 70 countries, we recognize that even the terminologies that we may use may not necessarily be identical, but as I said, there is an understanding, a fundamental understanding that we believe in the role of arts and culture and how that informs, inspires, challenges as beings in this very complex world that we live in today. As Stefan said, afterwards we will invite our other board members to join us here, but I am very privileged to be sitting next to two very incredible men. There are also incredible women on our board, and you will hear from them too. But I think we chose, well, one, to look at what Canada is doing and then the contrast of Namibia, just to give you an example, and it's just to go deeper into some of those, and then we have a look at what is happening overall. So I guess with that, why don't we go, I thought it would be important to maybe start with some definitions. So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 19, says everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression and to seek, receive, and impart information through any media and regardless of frontiers. The freedom of opinion and expression is included in Article 19, and it was adopted in 1948. Freedom of expression is considered an elemental aspect of democratic societies and both a fundamental and a foundational human right. Freedom of expression is necessary for participatory democracy and essential for other human rights to be achieved. Freedom of expression shares the same principle of non-discrimination as other human rights. No distinctions are permitted on the basis of someone's level of education, race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property or birth or other status. Freedom of expression is a fundamental right, but also subject to restrictions based on public order, national security, morals, and other issues. Freedom of expression in the arts involves the rights of artists to express their ideas, beliefs, and visions in any artistic or creative form, free from restrictions. Restrictions on the freedom of artistic expression usually take the form of implicit or explicit censorship, as well as limited opportunities for production and distribution and cooperation in the artistic field. I thought I would start with this because there are, and we will discuss here, various interpretations of what we talk about when, or what different contexts mean when they speak of freedom of artistic expression. We know, and please excuse that we're not as well versed as we'd like, but in the Swedish context, we know that it's part of your Swedish cultural policy, and that is your first objective. And we also know that access for everyone is also very much embedded in that. So I guess within the context that IFACCA works in, recognizing the diversity of contexts, freedom of artistic expression continues to be paramount in terms of ensuring this dynamism is happening within the different countries and the different contexts. This is something that is in a way part of our value system. We definitely support that. And we always look at ensuring, and in dialogue with our national members and also affiliate members, to ensure that there is a dialogue between civil society, government, and the other actors. We also refer to a lot to the 2005 Convention from Unesco, which is on the protection and promotion of diversity of cultural expressions. And there are 4 particular objectives that emerged from the recent global report, which if you haven't read, I do recommend, because they are very well aligned in terms of the importance of artistic freedom. One of them is around participatory governance, and that is about who is involved in the definition, in the defining, in the designing of policy and cultural life. The second one is looking at the sustainability and how we are definitely related to the 2030 agenda, which is around the sustainable development goals that all countries should be aspiring to, and our commitments to that. The third, and excuse, I have mixed the orders. The third one is around digitalization and how this new space that we're working in, which is a reality, is also affecting at times our artistic freedom. Who is controlling the World Wide Web? Who is making decisions? I'm certain we all feel quite uncomfortable in our social media when suddenly there are algorithms that are making decisions on our behalf as to where we're going, what we are engaged in, and who are defining those spaces. And also how our artist and artistic content is protected in those spaces. And then finally, the one that is directly related, which is around also the free flow of movement of people and the fundamental rights of freedom of artistic expression. And that also involves diversity, equality, and ensuring that everybody has an opportunity to not only participate in the value chain, whether you're a creator or as an audience member in that value chain. So that is more of a general overview in terms of the space that we work in, and now we'll go more precise into examples of how two agencies in very different contexts are responding, are challenging, are navigating what it means, this importance of freedom of artistic expression. So we will start first with Simon Burrow, who is the Director and CEO of the Canada Council for the Arts, who actually comes from the sector, many years working in theatre, leading the major institution, and who also is the chair of our board. Simon, over to you.
So I'm very pleased to be here. As Magdalena said, I spent all my life more in the theatre world, and also being really in the trenches, fighting for more money and more recognition for culture. It's only 5 years ago that I moved from my city. I'm francophone, so you can hear my accent. English is not my first language. And I moved to become the CEO of the Canada Council, which is the main funder of the arts in Canada. And the Canada Council funds both the institutions, organizations, collective of artists, individual artists. And it's an organization now that my team is more or less 300 people, and we are enjoying in this moment a very unique situation in the world, which is that the budget of the Canada Council is doubled over 5 years. So we are in a moment, it's the year 3 of that movement, and we are in a moment of rapid growth and a moment of investment in the arts. And before the government made the decision to double the budget, and if there are questions about that, I can tell the story about that doubling, because I could write a novel about it. But what was really kind of the mantra when I became the CEO of the Canada Council before the doubling was that if we would get money, the last thing in the world we would do is more of the same. So it was very clear, and I was very public about that, and very transparent, that if we would get new money, we would not do just consolidate and give the money to all the existing clients of the Canada Council. In fact, I could have given all the new money to only the symphony of my countries, and they would still be unhappy. But that was not the plan. So the mandate of the Canada Council, I will use my note. The legal mandate is to foster and promote the study and enjoyment of and the production of works in the arts. The way we see the mandate, to foster the study and enjoyment of the arts confers upon it an open and progressive social mission. That's how I read that. One that must constantly be updated, keeping in mind the contemporary nature of artistic creation in mind. What is really important is that the original architect of the council designed this notion of arm's length relationship with the government so that it could support the arts while also respecting the freedom of artists to undertake the artistic work that matter to them. I see the arm's length relationship both as the first aspect of it is that the government cannot interfere in our decisions. But the other aspect, equally important, is that the Arts Council needs to be able to do things at time that government would not dare to do for a lot of other reasons. So for me, arm's length is both a privilege and an immense responsibility. So while many Canadian citizens may not at this point recognize themselves in the current political, economical, and other institutions and systems, I think the Council, through its independence, provide an open public platform. Organizations need to shoulder their responsibility with a keen awareness of the current meaning and potential scope of their mandates. This awareness, for me, must demonstrate a shrewd understanding of society, and citizens must be able to relate to and see themselves in the actions of organizations. So the Canada Council sees that its role is more important in our democracy, in our evolving democracy. So for us, acknowledging social change, publicly countering the representation deficit, reflecting society as a whole, challenging the statu quo, questioning the arts sector claim to being always progressive, fostering the emergence and diversity of new ideas, essentially being an incubator and accelerator of social change. These are the way in which one's democratic legitimacy is earned and confirmed. I think that at one point in my country, the system of Arts Council was less and less legitimate from a democratical point of view, because the Arts Councils in my country became more or less prisoners of entitled clients, and were first and foremost serving those clients and not paying attention to everybody outside of the system. And life, by the way, is happening most of the time outside of our beautiful systems. So where the Council's influence is the most felt and where it must clearly express its intention and objectives are in its programs and funding decisions, obviously. The Council's intentions and objectives must evolve because society always finds ways to resolve contradictions or remove obstacles standing in the way of development. So the questions from both inside and outside the allowed halls of the Canada Council now are, and I can give you those very urgent questions, what exactly are we supporting? What is artistic excellence today? Who defines it? Who assesses it? Who are the peers being asked to pass judgment on the aesthetic value and relevance of the proposals? Who is being urged to submit grant applications? To whom are we talking? Under what circumstances and with what discourse? So these are the questions we're trying to address. In a very, because I'm conscious of the time, what is very important is that we realize more and more that the expectations concerning the Council's decisions are growing beyond the rather small circle of our grant recipients. For artists and organizations looking for public sector support and institutional validation, the expectations vis-à-vis the Canada Council are essentially financial. Let's be honest. For a growing portion of the public, and more specifically for groups or movements seeking recognition, equality, social justice, and inclusion, the expectations are more and more political and ethical. At the crossroads of these expectations, the Council's activity take on their complexity. It is also where the Council redefines its civic role, its civic footprint. It's my belief that the Council must attempt to grasp, clarify, and articulate the issues. It can initiate dialogue, create space for mediation, and even directly facilitate sectorial change by supporting initiatives emerging from the arts milieu itself, as it did recently by promoting workplaces free from bullying and sexual harassment in Canada. The notion of arts for art's sake is less and less accepted, And the expectation is that the public funding of arts and culture will contribute to the much desired democratic utopia that is the common good for public interest. Absolute sovereignty of artistic freedom and accusation of wanting to exploit artistic creation to serve social political ends. These are very interesting discussions right now in my country. There is a wide margin for frank and open debate, especially regarding freedom and responsibility. We believe that it goes hand to hand. Victor Hugo used to say that everything that grows freedom grows responsibility. So we think that the battle for freedom is absolutely essential, but it goes with the question of public values and responsibility. And we have to ask the question, what are the voices that have up until now being excluded? Because if freedom of speech means freedom of speech for just a portion of society, we have a problem with freedom of speech. So the question of inclusion and the question of giving more power to the voices that have been excluded so far is, in my country, something really important. Artistic freedom cannot run counter the recognition and the respect for everyone's cultural rights and operate outside the society in which these rights evolve. When it infringes on these rights, artistic freedom creates spaces rife with mistrust, as it was the case in the Me Too movement and the highly publicized controversy around cultural appropriation in my country. Making headways in the arts is not a given. Artistic expression must not become a prerogative. Art's immense symbolic significance impacts society in various ways. It can be used to justify and reinforce the established order or its underlying power dynamics. Art expresses, illustrates, critiques, questions, alters, and sometimes even transcends the hope and failings of society through artistic offerings that counter banality and grayness, if not darkness and horror. From the moment it takes shape, artistic creation is necessarily of its time, as must be public support. It cannot find itself at odds with the ideal of the common good. It cannot abandon the democratic quest for which our institution, all of our institutions, should not evade if they hope to endure. I will end by a quote that I really like from a friend and colleague, Astra Taylor, who wrote recently, "The forces of oligarchy have been enabled in part by our tendency to accept a highly prescribed notion of democracy, one that limits popular power to the field of electoral politics, ignoring the other institutions and structures like workplaces, prisons, schools, hospitals, environment, and that shape people's lives. This is a mistake." So she's arguing that if we want to really reconquer or fight for democracy, we need to pay attention to much more than just the electoral game. We also need to pay attention to our institutions and to what we do. So at Canada Council, in order to be true to those values, when we got the announcement of the doubling, and in fact, we got the announcement of the doubling because of those commitments, we committed that we would revise entirely the suite of our programs. We went from 150 programs to 6 now. We also made commitments that we would move the needle in terms of the repartition between the money that goes to institutions and permanent organizations, what we call core funding, to project funding, to make sure that half of our budget would be devoted to project funding to reinforce an independent scene that has the capacity to re-energize and revitalize the institutional scene of our country. We also made a very bold commitment, which is that 25% of all the new money, and it's a lot of money over 5 years, would go to first-time recipients of grants at Canada Council to really allow the possibility of attracting and including new voices in the cultural system. We made the commitment that we would triple the investment for the indigenous arts in our country, and not only that, but that we would change the way we support indigenous art, moving from a very Eurocentric definition of what art is and theater and visual arts and all of that, and support them in their own terms with the protocol and the vision and the cosmology of the indigenous people of our country. And finally, we made the commitment that we would be very, very transparent in terms of really explaining where the money goes. That's my conclusion. I think that it's very difficult to create any change in society if you only limit your action to discourses. I think that until the moment you change the power dynamics, until the moment you change the flow of investments, nothing really happens. Everybody is for inclusion and democracy and freedom and all of that. But if we don't change, where the money goes, if we don't empower new artistic voices in our society, that was the case in Canada, if we don't give more power to marginalized and disenfranchised communities, nothing really will happen, because we will tend to reproduce over and over what was in place 60 years ago. And it has been 4 years now that we are in that immense journey of refoundation of the Canada Council and changing why we invest and where we invest. And we can already see, because it's the first time this year, it's the beginning of the cultural season, where we see on the stages in Canada and also worldwide an incredible emergence of new creators, new voices, new topics that are dealt with. And it is the result of those investments where we consolidated the actual clients of the Canada Council, but also we opened for the first time the doors of the system to include, again, new voices and new possibilities and people who come with different understanding and a different vision of what freedom means in terms of expressing what they need to express to exist and to shine at the national and international stage. So that's my presentation.
Can you hear me? Thank you very much, Simon. Simon writes a lot and speaks a lot in public, and you can read all of his speeches and access to all of that material and the work that they have done at the Canada Council website. He's a very solid tweeter as well, so you can also follow him, so which again will reinforces a lot of the things that he has said. There are a lot of things that I've jotted down, but there is this, where there is tension or balance around freedom and responsibility, and whose freedom, and what are those voices that have been excluded. Certainly, I think we will come back to that. So over to Namibia. The wonderful Namibia.
Thank
over
you,
to you, Patrick.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. I just want to see by a show of hands, how many people know Namibia? Yes? No, you know, some people call it Namibia. Some people call it shithole countries, you know, so I just want to get a sense of what the spectrum is here. So the majority of the room knows Namibia. My question is, did you know that Namibia used to be part of South Africa? And you know that we freed South Africa in terms of, we became independent in 1990. We had a very intense struggle there. And you know that we don't tell that story globally. Did you also know that we are a result of international solidarity? I'm free. I'm older than my country. It's turning 30 next year. So I've lived in a post-conflict society. Growing up there, understanding the historical context of, one, what does international solidarity mean, just to frame this conversation, is a commitment towards the human family. That's why Sweden would fund, whether it's the liberation movements. Many of my friends grew up here as a result of not a commitment to Namibia, but a commitment to humans. And I think that's an important disposition to depart from when we talk about the responsibility. I think responsibility is layered. And as people, irrespective of being a nation state, irrespective of race, culture, sexuality, in terms of values, what is our value towards humans, the human family, human development? That's really the question I want to park and try to answer at the end. But when it comes to the topic, I really want to contextualize it because in the Southern Hemisphere, we have many problems. You have problems from education to health to gender-based violence to nutrition. Kids aren't eating enough. Maybe it's got 2 deserts. So we have a multiplicity of challenges. And even as a country with one of the most advanced constitutions, where in the preamble we talk about the pursuit to happiness, we talk about equality and equity, the reality is that 30 years later, we live in the most unequal society, top 3 in the world with South Africa and Brazil. The reality is that upward mobility or mass mobility is not defined for women or youth or marginalized people or people living with disabilities. The reality is that power, privilege, resources, systems are there to reproduce the same inequalities, and these things are then extended to artistic freedom. But the bigger conversation for me is around democracy, because the idea is that artistic freedom is a reflection or a vehicle of how democratic we are. This is merely the how do we embed the rituals of democracy. It is through allowing our artistic freedom. And when we're looking at it, I think for me, it has to be at a various levels. And I'm going to get to the Art Council, but I think I want to make first a philosophical dispensation that looks at this vehicle for us in what we're talking about in Africa, decolonizing. The impacts of colonialism will never be understood. The burden in intergenerational trauma, the displacement from land, from your own dignity as a person, the disconnect is huge, right? As a human, as somebody who has, under the Universal Declaration that you spoke about, is entitled to those rights. We haven't had them on the African continent, and we still don't continue to. And the lived experience, you juxtapose it with an average Sweden, an average Namibia, is as we live in 2 different planets. Right, so what is our response towards this democratic deficit that's been in our country, but I see that's growing in the West? And the uncertainty that lies around artistic freedom, that lies around our society, what do we do with it? How do we respond? Is really the question. Do we acknowledge there's a democratic deficit? Here it's increasing. I think with us it's been so big it can't increase anymore, it's just reducing. But the question is, are you okay with the democratic deficit that is there? And the answer probably is no. So now the question is then, how do we respond to it? So I think what Simon was doing was articulating an Art Council response towards the democratic deficits that exist when it comes to just individuals, when it comes to the collective and society. Now, okay, so the question around decolonizing is very important for us. And decolonizing essentially means the difference between finding a system that works for everybody, because colonialism, there's hegemony. There's one way of being. There's supremacy. And those values, and you might not recognize it, have become so ingrained in a lot of these colonial societies that you don't even question them anymore. And we don't question the inferiority of how we have normalized not having access, not having privilege. So it's almost like there's a mismatch, all right? So at an individual level, identity is important. So for us, we're questioning in the Art Council, given a society like Namibia, our first question is, we're turning 30 next year, and currently we are dealing with a campaign. We also have a tribe, we have tribal politics, we have 11 tribes, we have a tribe that's a majority in the country. But how do we now articulate in Namibia with 11 tribes? I speak this language, you greet more meme here, you are what's happening here, right? I think it's important to understand in terms of identity, the historical structures versus pluralism. So one of the things that I'm proud about in being Namibian, and I think that's embedded in the values of our Art Council, is that we're Namibian because of our differences, less because of our similarities. And I think this is becoming an important narrative in societies where pluralism is not accustomed, where you've had a homogenic historical society. So that's important in terms of identity, but multiple identities. Can you have multiple identities as the Art Council when it comes to artistic expression? Because I think the inability to understand multiple identities will then lead to the constraints of why you want to limit an artistic freedom. So in principle, we have to ask ourselves value questions. What values do we have? Our value, number one as the Art Council, is to acknowledge the multiple identities that are inherent within our society. That's one. Second, we're talking about culture. Culture for us is the way of life versus way of life and the expression of life. And I think the second one is important in this context. So the Art Council, from our perspective, when we look at culture, it is how do we provide room with limited resources, incredibly limited. Our budget didn't get doubled, our doubled cut. So we have half the money that we used to have 5 years ago. You know, so the reality is almost juxtaposed. Canada, don't worry. So I think that's important. So the Art Council, because for us, we don't differentiate ourselves through the collective effort that government is doing, right? And this is what's interesting. When people have a greater sense against government, what we have done is we've really asked the question around who's responsible. And we live in a republic. And in the republic, it's the people that are responsible. So I don't want to distinguish between the government, because the government, it's people. There might be institutions, but what is the responsibility of the people? So this concept of social accountability, society must account for the reality that they create. So how are we accounting for it in our Art Council? I think that's an important question. And the way I'll answer that, it's very difficult because of limited resources. But what we have done, and I'll tell you, this is talking to somebody 2 weeks ago from Rwanda who says when Rwanda happened, and Rwanda is a success story now in Africa in terms of, well, people talk about the violations of rights, but also in terms of the development progress. So where they were, you can say that progress has been made. But what's essential is that the bishop said, when Rwanda happened, everything was crushed except the human spirit. Now people wonder, how do you Africans live on less than $1 a day? How do you make it? Because we have the ability to nurture the human spirit. And essentially, arts, culture, and heritage nurtures the human spirit. And the conversations that we have around the human spirit are on the periphery. Because why? When we were colonized and we were spirited, part of removing and oppressing and suppressing and repressing us was to put the spirit on the periphery. We are reintroducing that as a core function because that addresses how you nurture the human spirit. And that's how we're able to overcome. That's how in Namibia, we had a big apartheid government who had nuclear weapons. We were able to fight them because the spirit is important. And I think as Africans, this is what we have to offer the world. And we nurture the spirit by advocating for, through an arts summit that we hosted about 3 years ago, we are now advocating at a regional level. I personally am doing my PhD on a regional integration and how arts, culture, and heritage plays a role within that. That's commissioned through the Art Council to provide the evidence of how important the spirit is towards people, society, and human development in general. And I think the questions that I would like to interact is how cognizant or intentional are we around this? Another one that burdens me is society, because we don't talk about well-being. And when we talk about well-being, it has to be within a macro sense. So how do we take care of people? How do we take care of the planet? And how do we ensure prosperity? Now, as the council, again, our mandate has changed, that we're really not, and maybe you have the privilege in another context to say, this is sector-driven. We don't have that privilege. Our privilege really is just to develop people, to give them dignity, to allow them to have a pursuit of happiness. And we want to use this vehicle. So we have a bigger goal. So therefore, I was also confused in talking about this, because I feel like talking about this topic in itself is a privilege when it's not associated to how it affects society, how it affects social justice. It's almost like you don't recognize the blind spot in how privilege, and the blind spot of privilege is fragility, all right? And then within that fragility, do you acknowledge unlearning? Are we ready to unlearn? And I think arts, culture, and heritage, because there's a hegemony, the better speakers get to speak, the better writers get to get read, but art is really the most equitous form for people to speak in multiple ways, to be significant, to be connected, to be able to contribute participatory in this democratic dispensation. We don't do that. Can we live for things that are bigger than us? We can't. Fourth and last part is economy. A lot of African countries, when it comes to artistic expression, people are like, can I make money? I need to eat. The question really is not so much around individual success, but it's about mass mobility. Can we take the masses out of poverty? They say the biggest evil on the planet is poverty. I'm a well-educated man. I've had privilege. I've even gone to the best schools in the world, but I'm incredibly still impoverished, because the number of dependents that I have in my family don't allow for that. So success cannot be measured just around individuality. It has to be the I and the we. And these two things aren't mutually exclusive. But you cannot center a whole human family and disaggregate it just to the point of measuring success around the individual. It has to be compounded with measures around society, around community, around the we, and who is the we. So mass mobility is important. And I'll tell you how the Art Council now, just in terms of all of these four, economy, I'll tell you that's the biggest one. And we're making very fundamental arguments. One is that as Africans, we don't own things. This is the fastest way to own something. Intellectual property, copyright, trademark. I'm like, I own something. So that's important. We can't own our diamonds. We don't own our minds. We don't own any other platform that can lead to mobility. But this sector becomes fundamental for human development. And we say, when we ran the summit, our theme was, human creativity is the most vital economic, social, and cultural resource. So that's the only thing we have, human creativity, because we don't own anything else. We don't own our land. We don't own our food. We don't own our narrative. We don't own our products. We don't own the networks or the whatever digital platforms. We don't own things. So what power do we have? Right? So in owning that, we're making a very big economic argument that we're saying, we're giving you ownership, but we're compounding that with the cheapest per capita intervention. Because if governments want to talk about just creating employment, we're like, low stakes, lowest benchmark. We're talking not just about employment, creation. We are talking about the possibility of ownership and mass mobility. We're talking about the cheapest per capita interventions, because the person already owns the product. Now it's the cheapest, because to create jobs costs money. So the Art Council, we are at a stage where we have to change, not just through activity. We have to change the mindset. We have to change the emotional maturity of our nation. And at the same time, because we have to address things like intergenerational trauma. So we have leaders that are in positions that just don't have the right knowledge. People talk about, why is Mugabe till it's 95? Well, people generally get an opportunity when they're 20, they work till 60. Mugabe got an opportunity when he was 50, he must work till 90. So why do opportunities come late to Africans? Why do opportunities come late to this part of the world that by 2035 is going to be half of the world's population? So Sweden and to the rest of the world, pluralism, multiculturalism, multiple identities, mass mobility are things that are inevitable. And if you don't update your software, you're running on an old operating system that is going to be obsolete, And the opportunity cost or the unintended consequences of that might be greater if we don't respect the intentions of how we are going to democratize. So a lot of our work is around changing people's spirits and then saying, we have programs. Giving you the evidence and saying, you know what, we're willing to be your partners. But the change for us starts with the human spirit, because that's what Africa has, so that's what's kept Africa alive, and that's what we have to offer the world.
Thank you.